every morning you would have all these dead, and each group in the camp was divided by barracks, more or less how many people were in this group, in this barracks, and so forth. And in the morning, you had morning formation to find out how many people were still alive. And of course, those who were alive were able to form. Those who were sick were in the hospital. Those who were dead stayed in the barracks. After the formation, you would have groups of men assigned as burial details, and they would go to the different barracks, take the dead out, and then what they would do was they would use a bamboo pole, and if they had blankets, they would wrap the body in the blankets, tie the blankets to the bamboo pole, and then carry the pole on their shoulders. So you had two men carrying one dead body. If they didn't have the blankets, in many cases they didn't have the blankets, then they simply had to tie the arms and the feet of the dead person to the poles, and then they carried them in that long, endless march of death. So there was a grave site, there was a cemetery area just outside the camp. It's now inside the compound. And there the dead were buried. And in order to accommodate the number of dead, they dug trenches, large trenches, mass graves, and they laid the bodies down, back down, at least in the early stage. So they were all flat on their backs, and then when the next group came in, then they were put on top of that first row, and then the third row, and so forth. And then that was, once it reached a certain level, they covered it with earth. But as time went on and the number of dead increased, they found out they could no longer lay them on their backs. That it used up too much space. So they instead put them on their sides to squeeze in more people in the graves as they could. Now, since the prisoners were very weak, it was they who had to dig these graves. There were no power shovels or anything. They had to physically dig the graves. They were very weak that they could not dig very deep graves. And so therefore, when the rainy season came, you would have some of the earth being washed out, and actually the remains coming out again. You would have bones sticking out. You would have hair sticking out here and there. It was a very gory sight after that. There were several. One of the there were several individual cases where those who dropped out of line were shot or bayoneted, but there were cases where there were large-scale massacres. One of these is in what took place. It took place in what near a river called the Pantingan River, and this was a whole group of men, 500, 600, who were segregated from the other men marching, taken to this particular place, tied up with telephone wire, and then systematically beheaded or bayoneted. This would be the single most atrocious event in the march because it was a mass murder. And the Japanese who committed this would even say that they got tired of it because beheading people and bayoneting them for the whole afternoon can get very tiring, and actually they had reliefs of people doing the killing. And it was a continuous sending of the prisoners to the execution site, and then the whole afternoon they did nothing but execute all these people, kick them off the small cliff, and that was it. So it was the single most brutal incident in the death march that took place. Well, the Philippines was changed in many ways after the end of the war. First, as people who lived through that like to say, it made the Filipinos harder. It made them more mature. It showed that we could take it. So in one sense, there was a kind of optimism that we've proved ourselves to the whole world. But that tended to be short-lived because the more serious problems were problems of a ruined economy. 80% of the Philippine economy was destroyed. Most of the cities were destroyed and the infrastructure was blasted to bits. The death toll, the official death toll was 1,100,000 Filipinos died as a result of the war. That was out of a population of 17 million, which means 1 out of 17 Filipinos died during the war. This included farmers, businessmen, intellectuals, government officials. So it ran the whole gamut of the best Filipinos all the way down to the most typical Filipino. So So 1 million Filipinos gone. And so the economy derailed, destroyed, the buildings destroyed also. There was also a moral dilemma at that time because since Filipinos did anything to survive the war, and this meant stealing from the Japanese, not following orders, because disobedience was itself a sign of patriotism if you disobeyed the Japanese. That meant after the war, how do you bring in a system of authority? How do you reconstruct that system of obedience that was there before the war? So right after the war, you have this moral problem, you have this problem of restoring authority, and it would take years to get out of that. So in terms of manufacturing, the Philippines is only able to reach the pre-war manufacturing levels by around 1952-53. So all the years after the war, you're struggling to rebuild everything, and all that took a lot of time. And again, there would be more deaths and more problems as a result of that. Okay, actually, when the war started, the Philippine Army had been inducted into the service of the United States. So technically, that meant that the Filipinos should have been eligible for benefits, back pay, and all of this. Except that the military order calling the Philippine Army to U.S. service was so worded that it actually did not mean you were really being taken in as a legitimate unit of the U.S. Army. When you say called into service, it means you're simply being called to fight together with the U.S. Army. It does not mean you are a U.S. Army unit. And so therefore, based on that particular nuance, after World War II, the Filipino veterans were supposed to get benefits from the U.S. government, disability benefits, back pay, and so forth. But in order to do this, they had to be recognized first. And the members of the Philippine Army you could reconstruct rosters and come out with what the divisions, who the men in the divisions were. But one problem was that so many Filipinos had volunteered to fight in Bataan, even if they didn't join any unit, that there was no record for these people. So college graduates, college students, even high school students, they just hopped on a bus, went to Bataan, and there was no paper. So there was nothing to prove that they were in Bataan. And what made things more complicated was the guerrilla issue. Because now guerrillas, how do you consider them? Were they part of the regular army, or do you pay them the same amount as those who fought in Bataan? And one comes up with a big dilemma here, especially when the number of Filipinos who claimed to be guerrillas mushroomed. There were so many, I think it reached about 1 million claimed that they were guerrillas in the active service. And it's at this point that I think the US Congress, looking at all of this, said, we cannot pay for all of this. And therefore, if we recognize every single one of them, there are phonies in this. It's going to take so much time to find out who the real veterans are, separate them from the phonies. So this is why the Recession Act was passed. And then they looked into it. They said this was never really part of the U.S. Army. The guerrillas were not part of the U.S. Army. The Philippine Army had its own rates of pay. It had its own rules of promotion. It was not part of the U.S. Army. And because of that, the Recession Act was passed, which pushed most of the Filipino veterans out of the orbit of the GI Bill of Rights and other regular benefits. What made it more tragic was, for people in the Philippine Army who had fought in Bataan, when they asked for their back pay, 3 years of back pay, the U.S. government looked at it and said, you only served 4 months in Bataan. What did you do after you were released from prison camp? And many of them were too sick to join the guerrillas. So a lot of them just stayed home. If they joined the guerrillas, they were intelligence officers, but a lot of them had no papers to prove this. And so the U.S. government could simply say, we're only going to pay you for your months in Bataan. And it turns out they already paid them during that period. A lot of people were paid at that time. And the U.S. government even said, we also paid for your insurance benefits. And therefore, after they computed all of this, some veterans, it was found out, owed the U.S. government some money, even after all the suffering they had had in prison camp and the death march and all of this. And some veterans were very surprised to get notices from the U.S. Treasury saying you owe the government $1, $1.25. or even sometimes cents. And the Filipino veterans were they were so frustrated by all this, they were so disappointed that a lot of them said, we are not going to pay the US government. They are the ones who owe us money. And they created an association called the Payback Veterans Association. So rather than back pay, they said, no, we are payback veterans. And a number of them framed these treasury warrants saying, you owe the US government $1 or so forth. A number of them framed that and have it in their houses today. Sometimes the amounts were so small, ridiculously small, that the paper and the postage spent to get that notice to the veteran was more than what they were trying to get. So they said, this is all bureaucracy gone mad. So it was really very disappointing for most of the veterans.